We now look at the harrowing story of Catherine Howard. Catherine was one of the daughters of Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper. Her father's sister, Elizabeth Howard, was the mother of Anne Boleyn. Therefore, Catherine Howard was the first cousin of Anne Boleyn, and the first cousin once removed of Lady Elizabeth, later Queen Elizabeth I. Catherine had an aristocratic pedigree. Her father was not wealthy, being the third son among 21 children, and he suffered under the custom of the firstborn legitimate child inheriting the parents' entire or main estate, in preference to it being shared by all or some other children. These few lines underline the fascinating clash of high pedigree and limited financial means in Catherine's upbringing. Despite her noble blood, amplified by her connection to the tragic Anne Boleyn, her immediate family lacked stable funds. The Howards were a prominent clan in Tudor England. They had placed Anne Boleyn on the throne as Henry's second wife, but they were also prone to the fluctuations of royal favor. Lord Edmund Howard, Catherine's father, found himself in the shadow of more fortunate siblings. He could not offer his children the sort of lavish lifestyle often associated with the nobility. This gap between aristocratic reputation and economic reality would shape Catherine's early life, forcing her parents to seek help from richer relatives. One can imagine the tension and uncertainty this created for a young girl who bore such a grand surname, yet lived without the stable household that might have protected her from predatory influences later on. Here begins the paradox of Catherine's existence. Elevated enough to enter the royal sphere, yet lacking the resources and caution that might have preserved her safety. Crucially, her familial connection to Anne Boleyn foreshadows what would become a haunting legacy. Anne's downfall, accused of adultery, incest, and treason, left the Boleyn-Howard faction with a precarious reputation. Although the Howards reclaimed some favor at times, the memory of Anne Boleyn's beheading hovered over any subsequent Howard woman introduced to Henry's attention. Catherine was thus both blessed and cursed by her lineage. When Catherine's parents married, her mother already had 5 children from her first husband, Ralph Lee, and she went on to have another 6 with Catherine's father, Catherine being about her mother's 10th child. With little to sustain the family, her father was often reduced to begging for handouts from his more affluent relatives. Soon after the death of her mother, in about 1528, Catherine was sent with some of her siblings to live in the care of her father's stepmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess presided over large households at Chesworth House in Horsham, Sussex, and at Norfolk House in Lambeth. Dozens of attendants, along with her many wards, usually the children of aristocratic but poor relatives, resided there. The Duchess, however, was often at court and seems to have had little direct involvement in the upbringing of her wards and young female attendants. As a result, there was certainly a lack of discipline. Catherine became influenced by some older girls who allowed men into the sleeping areas at night for entertainment. The girls were entertained with food, wine, and gifts stolen from the kitchens. These details about Catherine's younger years are critical for understanding her vulnerabilities. She came from a large blended family, with her mother having multiple children before and after marrying Lord Edmund Howard. In a Tudor society that prized order and lineage, Catherine's environment felt anything but orderly. Finances were tight, parental guidance was minimal, and the children had to rely on the goodwill of more privileged relatives. Once her mother passed away, Catherine moved into the household of the Dowager Duchess, a setting that might have promised some form of aristocratic guidance. Instead, it turned out to be a loosely managed environment where adult oversight was inconsistent. While the Dowager Duchess herself was a notable figure at court, her prolonged absences left Catherine in a ward system that permitted older girls to host nighttime gatherings with men. This was hardly the strict moral setting one would expect for a future queen. This environment likely shaped Catherine's understanding of boundaries and propriety, or lack thereof. If flirting, sneaking men into bedchambers, and late-night feasts with stolen food were standard in her teenage sphere, Catherine would have had little cause to see such behavior as grievously wrong. Nor would she have developed the cautious mindset needed to navigate the intense moral scrutiny of the Tudor court. She was essentially learning by example, an example that would later seem reckless in the eyes of King Henry VIII's advisers and the wider political establishment. It is vital to note that while some of the older wards engaged in these nighttime escapades, Catherine was hardly unique in partaking. The real danger lay in how these experiences would be interpreted once she stepped into a world where rumors and reputations spelled life or death. This chaotic upbringing introduced her to secrecy and clandestine behavior well before she ever set foot in the royal court, forging patterns that would, in time, contribute to her demise. Catherine was not as well educated as some of Henry's other wives, although on its own her ability to read and write was impressive enough at the time. Her character has often been described as vivacious, giggly, and brisk, but never scholarly or devout. She displayed great interest in her dance lessons, but would often be distracted during them and make jokes. This portrait of Catherine as a merry, somewhat playful young woman stands in stark contrast to the intellectual or politically aware consorts Henry once prized. Women like Catherine of Aragon, who was well-read and deeply devout, or Anne Boleyn, who had honed her wit in the courts of Europe. Catherine Howard, on the other hand, took pleasure in dancing, quick jokes, and light-hearted conversation. This very quality seemed to charm Henry, who by then was weary of strained or overly intellectual discourse. However, we must understand how such traits would fail to protect Catherine when real intrigue began. Tudor society placed immense value on chastity and decorum in a queen consort. Her focus on amusements rather than serious learning left her ill-prepared to sense the dangers swirling around her at court. The ability to read and write, while notable for a woman of that era, did not make up for a lack of political savvy or religious gravitas. In many ways, Catherine's personality would prove a double-edged sword. Her giggliness and friendly demeanor initially captured Henry's attention, acting like a breath of fresh air. But once rumors emerged about her moral failings, real or perceived, her lack of devoutness or studiousness meant few courtiers stepped forward to defend her. She had built no strong faction based on intellect or piety to counter the accusations. At the same time, her youthful spirit might have seemed like a hope for the aging, ailing king who was already on his fourth marriage. He likely longed for a wife who was content to play music, dance, and distract him from his chronic leg pain and foul moods. For a brief period, Catherine was that source of joy, until her past and ongoing indiscretions overshadowed that initial appeal. Around 1536, Catherine began music lessons with two teachers, one of whom was Henry Manox. Evidence exists that Manox was not married, which would be highly unusual for someone from his background. But subsequently a relationship of sorts began between Catherine and Manox, and although the relationship was abusive, with Manox grooming and preying on Catherine, Catherine became increasingly repulsed by Manox's pressure to lose her virginity to him, and was angered by his gossiping with servants about the details of what had gone between them. When Catherine was questioned during her adultery inquisition, she was quoted as saying, "At the flattering and fair persuasions of Manox, being but a young girl, I suffered him at sundry times to handle and touch the secret parts of my body, which neither became me with honesty to permit nor him to require." Catherine's attention soon turned elsewhere. Francis Derham was a Tudor courtier who had started a relationship with Catherine in late 1538. She was 15 at the time. Derham believed that he loved her when their affair began. In these lines, we see the beginning of Catherine's personal entanglements that would later resurface to condemn her. The mention of Henry Manox stands out because it details not just a youthful romance, but an abusive dynamic where Manox was grooming and preying on Catherine. Given that she was barely in her teens and he was her music teacher, the imbalance of power is glaring. Modern eyes would label this a predatory relationship, though Tudor society may not have articulated it that way. Catherine's own testimony during her later inquisition reveals how uncomfortable she felt about Manox's advances. She felt pressured, and while she allowed certain intimacies, she was troubled by them. This conflict between compliance and resentment speaks volumes about her vulnerability. After Manox, Catherine turned her affections to Francis Derham, another step in her teenage journey. Derham appeared to be more serious in his feelings, even convincing Catherine that their bond was real love. Yet, for a girl of 15, discerning genuine affection from infatuation or manipulation was no easy feat, especially within the labyrinth of a Tudor noble household. These experiences set a pattern, Catherine learning about sexual and romantic matters in a chaotic, clandestine manner, with older individuals who did not prioritize her well-being. What is striking is how these episodes would eventually be used as official evidence against her when she entered Henry's life. In the Tudor court, a queen's sexuality had to be beyond reproach to maintain her legitimacy. Any past behavior, no matter how coerced or naive, could be interpreted as moral corruption. And so, the seeds of Catherine's eventual downfall were planted long before she ever caught the king's eye. However, Derham's relationship with Catherine came to an end when her music master, Henry Manox, sent an anonymous letter to the Dowager Duchess. Manox, who had started a sexual relationship with Catherine and molested her when she was only 13, suggested that the Duchess should visit Catherine's bedroom half an hour after going to bed, adding that, "You shall see that which shall displease you." As a result, Derham was sent away, and Catherine was told off for her banqueting by night, because the Duchess feared it would hurt her beauty. Unfortunately for Derham, Catherine's heart did not grow fonder while he was away, and the relationship ended. For now, a new man was on the horizon, and one for Catherine that indeed changed her life once again. To fully appreciate the scandal behind Manox's anonymous letter, one must consider his likely motives. Having already engaged in a problematic liaison with Catherine, he now sought to undermine Derham's rival claim to Catherine's attention. By informing the Dowager Duchess of the nightly visits, Manox showcased a manipulative streak that would push Catherine into a more formal confrontation. The Duchess's reaction, sending away Derham and simply cautioning Catherine about losing her beauty due to nightly banqueting, reveals how superficial her concerns could be. She did not launch a moral or disciplinary crusade. She merely wanted to preserve Catherine's appearance, which suggests that the potential for scandal was overshadowed by practical fears about Catherine's attractiveness and future marriage prospects. The welfare of Catherine's emotions or long-term security was scarcely considered. In the end, Derham lost contact with Catherine. We can only speculate whether Catherine, left behind with the older Manox still around, felt any relief or sorrow. Yet this chapter of her life closed, paving the way for an entirely different future when her powerful uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, found her a place at the royal court. One cannot help but sense a tragic inevitability. She was leaving behind a messy teenage entanglement only to enter the lion's den of royal intrigue. Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, found her a place at court in the household of the king's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. As a young and attractive lady-in-waiting, Catherine quickly caught Henry's eye. The king had displayed little interest in Anne from the beginning, but on Thomas Cromwell's failure to find a new match for Henry, Norfolk saw an opportunity. The Howards may have sought to recreate the influence gained during Anne Boleyn's reign as queen consort. According to Nicholas Sander, the religiously conservative Howard family may have seen Catherine as a figurehead for their fight by express determination to restore Roman Catholicism to England. As the king's interest in Catherine grew, so did the House of Norfolk's influence. Her youth, prettiness, and vivacity were captivating for the middle-aged sovereign who claimed he had never known the like to any woman. Within months of her arrival at court, Henry bestowed gifts of land and expensive cloth upon Catherine. Henry called her his very jewel of womanhood. King Henry and Catherine were married by Bishop Bonner of London at Oatlands Palace on July 28, 1540. The same day, Cromwell was executed. She was a teenager and he was 49. Here, Catherine's life takes a dramatic leap. By becoming a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, she found herself in constant proximity to a king restless for a new emotional and physical connection. Henry VIII's dissatisfaction with Anne of Cleves, a politically motivated match that did not spark personal affection, created the perfect opening for someone like Catherine. Young, charismatic, and untainted by the heavier political or religious debates dominating court life. From the vantage point of the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's rise was a chance to reinvigorate the Howard family's position. They had once basked in power during Anne Boleyn's tenure, and though Anne's fall was catastrophic, the hunger for renewed prestige lingered. The mention of Nicholas Sander's theory, that conservative interests aimed to use Catherine as a Catholic-leaning figure, suggests a deeper political dimension. But Catherine herself, a teenager thrust into these maneuvers, likely had little clue how she was being deployed. Henry's immediate enchantment manifested in lavish gifts and praise. Calling her a very jewel of womanhood underscored his infatuation and his willingness to marry her. On the same day he executed Thomas Cromwell, symbolizes how decisively and ruthlessly Henry shifted his alliances. From Catherine's perspective, she moved from relative obscurity to the pinnacle of English nobility in a matter of months. It must have felt overwhelming, perhaps even thrilling, for someone who only recently had to endure the constraints of the Dowager Duchess's household. Yet, we must remember that Henry was an experienced monarch with a history of disposing of wives when they no longer served his needs. At 49, he was physically challenged by leg ulcers and likely bored by routine court life. In Catherine, he saw youthful vibrancy, a promise of new heirs, and an escape from the political entanglements that overshadowed his earlier marriages. For a brief, shining moment, Catherine Howard was the adored center of the king's world. The marriage was made public on August 8th, and prayers were said in the Chapel Royal and Hampton Court Palace. Henry indulged her every whim, thanks to her impulsiveness. Catherine was young, joyous, and carefree. She always loved music, and when she knew Mannix, he had taught her to play the virginals. This was a keyboard instrument of the harpsichord family. Although still very young at the time of her marriage, Henry would not allow Catherine to become involved in matters of state. It was as though she was at court as a distraction, and someone that Henry could escape to at times of need. There were never any plans made for her coronation, yet she still traveled down the river in the royal barge into the city of London to a gun salute and some acclamation. However, little changed at court other than the arrival of many Howards. In 1540, the Queen escaped plague-ridden London and went on a progress, or tour, as we might call it today. The royal couple's entourage traveled on honeymoon through Reading and Buckingham. The king embarked on a lavish spending spree to celebrate his marriage, with extensive refurbishments and developments at the Palace of Whitehall. This was followed by more expensive gifts for Christmas at Hampton Court Palace. That winter, though, the king's bad moods deepened and grew more furious. Undoubtedly, the pain from his ulcerous legs was agony, But this did not make relations any easier at court. He accused counselors of being lying time servers and began to regret losing Cromwell. After a dark, depressing March, his mood lifted at Easter, and his preparations were in place for any signs of a royal pregnancy. If it was found to be true, Catherine would be crowned at Whitsuntide. This glimpse into Catherine's early days as queen highlights her main functions from Henry's perspective: to bring lightness and amusement into his life, to possibly produce an heir, and to reignite some sense of youthful fun at court. She was not consulted on political matters or state decisions. Her role was ornamental and personal. The absence of a coronation is telling. Either Henry was waiting for proof of a child, or he was reluctant to invest heavily in formalizing Catherine's queenship when so many unknowns still loomed. Catherine's love of music continued, and her skill with the virginals, albeit introduced by the predatory Mannix, remained a pastime that delighted Henry. She exuded a joyful air at a court that had grown weary of the king's tempestuous moods and shifting policies. Yet behind the scenes, factional tensions remained. The Howards arrived in force, hoping to rebuild the influence once shattered by Anne Boleyn's downfall. Their presence likely stirred resentment among other courtiers. Meanwhile, Henry's deteriorating health and pangs of regret over Cromwell's execution fueled bouts of rage. The winter of 1540 to 1541 proved challenging for everyone, including Catherine, who saw the king's temper flare unpredictably. She might have hoped that giving him a child would secure her position. Henry, too, pinned hopes on a pregnancy. This single development, the birth of an heir, had repeatedly defined the success or failure of his previous marriages. For a girl in her late teens, that kind of pressure was immeasurable. Catherine may have been involved during her marriage to the king with Henry's favorite male courtier, Thomas Culpeper, a young man who had succeeded him in the queen's affections according to Derham's later testimony. She had considered marrying Culpeper during her time as a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves. Culpeper called Catherine "my little sweet fool" in a love letter, and it has been alleged that in the spring of 1541, the pair were meeting secretly. Their meetings had been arranged by one of Catherine's older ladies-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn or Lady Rochford. A crisis over Catherine's conduct now began to loom. People who had claimed to have witnessed her earlier sexual behavior while she was still a ward at Lambeth reportedly contacted her for favors in return for their silence, and some of these blackmailers may have been appointed to her royal household. Moving from the fleeting joys of queenship, we encounter the shadow of scandal that would soon envelop Catherine. The alleged affair with Thomas Culpeper stands as one of the most debated aspects of her story. Culpeper was not just any courtier but one of Henry's trusted men, making any rumored affair infinitely more dangerous. If true, Catherine was tempting fate by meeting him in secret. Why would she do so? Historians point to possible factors: isolation, lack of genuine companionship with Henry, or pre-existing fondness from her days as a lady-in-waiting. Some even suggest that Catherine's closeness to Culpeper might have been emotional rather than physical, but in Tudor England, appearances mattered deeply, and clandestine nighttime visits were enough to imply adultery. Meanwhile, figures from Catherine's past smelled the opportunity for blackmail. If they knew that the Queen had been light in her ways at the Dowager Duchess's household, they could demand posts or financial gain in exchange for silence. This was a lethal arrangement. Should Catherine fail to satisfy them, they might reveal everything. Should she appease them, more demands would likely follow. Tudor court watchers, always alert for advantage, might note the king's moods, the queen's vulnerabilities, and the howls of rumor swirling around them. Lady Rochford, once entangled in Anne Boleyn's downfall, re-emerged here as a facilitator. Whether out of misguided loyalty to Catherine or from a personal agenda. It was a volatile mix, an unsteady monarch, a naive queen, a meddling lady-in-waiting, and blackmailers ready to strike. John Lascelles, the brother of Mary Lascelles, claimed that he had tried to persuade his sister to find a place within the Queen's royal chamber. However, Mary had refused, stating that she had witnessed the light ways of Queen Catherine while they were living together at Lambeth. Supposedly, after hearing this, John Lascelles reported such news to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who then interrogated Lascelles' sister. Under the Archbishop's interrogation, Mary alleged that Catherine had had sexual relations while under the Duchess's care, before her relationship with the king. Cranmer immediately took up the case to be made to topple his rivals, the Roman Catholic Norfolk family. Lady Rochford was interrogated, and from fear of being tortured, agreed to talk. She told how she had watched for Catherine backstairs as Culpeper had made his escapes from the Queen's room. During the investigation, a love letter written in the Queen's distinctive handwriting was found in Culpeper's chambers. This is the only letter of hers that survived. Her final words would not just seal her fate, but also be used as her death warrant. "Trusting to see you shortly again, and I would you was with me now, that you might see what pain I take in writing to you. Yours, as long as life endures, Catherine." On All Saints' Day, the king was found praying in the Chapel Royal. There he received a letter describing the allegations against Catherine. With these revelations, Catherine's scandal morphed into a formal investigation. Archbishop Cranmer, a key figure in Henry's religious reformation, seized on the accusations. The Lascelles siblings became crucial witnesses, providing testimony that Catherine had engaged in sexual behavior prior to marrying the king. This alone could be framed as deception, since Henry believed, or wanted to believe, that he had married a chaste young bride. Mary Lascelles' refusal to serve Catherine, citing the Queen's past behavior, offered precisely the spark Cranmer needed. The entire investigation gained momentum, culminating in Lady Rochford's confession under potential torture. That, combined with the damning love letter discovered in Culpeper's chamber, created a near-airtight case in the eyes of Henry and his council. Such a scenario would have horrified Catherine. She was barely more than a teenager, confronted by the unstoppable machinery of Tudor justice, orchestrated by powerful men with their own agendas. Once the king learned of the alleged affair, while in prayer no less, the moral and emotional humiliation was swift and devastating. In a realm where kingship was intertwined with divine right, Catherine's betrayal carried both personal and religious weight. At first, he did not believe any of the information, but it would be later that things started to become more clear in Henry's head. On November 7, 1541, Archbishop Cranmer headed a delegation of counselors to Winchester Palace in Southwark to question her, and even the staunch Cranmer found the teenage Catherine's frantic, incoherent state pitiable. "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness, as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart to have looked upon her." Establishing the existence of a pre-contract between Catherine and Derham would have had the effect of terminating Catherine's royal union, but it would have also allowed Henry to annul their marriage and banish her from court in poverty and disgrace, instead of executing her, though there is no indication that Henry would have chosen that alternative. Yet Catherine steadfastly denied any pre-contract, maintaining that Derham had in fact raped her. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen on November 23, 1541, and imprisoned in the new Sion Abbey in Middlesex, formerly a convent, where she remained throughout the winter. She was forced by a privy councillor to return Anne of Cleves's ring that the king had given her. It was a symbol of her regal and lawful rights. The king would be at Hampton Court, but she would never see him again. Despite these actions taken against her, her marriage to Henry was never formally annulled. What we see here is the final undoing of Catherine Howard's short-lived status as queen. Initially, Henry VIII struggled to accept that yet another wife had betrayed him, but the mounting evidence, witness testimony, that fateful letter, broke through his denial. The king's chosen investigators descended on Catherine, finding her in hysterics and profound terror. Even Archbishop Cranmer, a man not known for sentimental weakness, was moved by Catherine's distress. The possibility of a pre-contract, which might have spared her life, hinged on Catherine admitting that she had effectively been betrothed to Derham before marrying Henry. Such an admission could have allowed an annulment. However, Catherine denied it all, insisting that any physical relations had been forced upon her. Whether this was the truth or her last desperate attempt to preserve some innocence remains uncertain. Henry, for his part, was unlikely to show mercy to a woman he believed had deceived him. The symbolic stripping of her title and removal of Anne of Cleves' ring signaled Catherine's complete fall from royal grace. Now she was a prisoner in Sion Abbey, isolated and awaiting whatever final decision Henry would hand down. That the marriage was never formally annulled implies Henry preferred to treat her offense as treason, a criminal act against the throne itself, rather than a mere marital irregularity. This choice spoke to the king's need for harsh retribution, one that would quell any perception of royal weakness. Culpeper and Derham were brought to court at Guildhall on December 1st, 1541, for high treason. They were executed at Tyburn on December 10th, 1541, Culpeper being beheaded and Derham being hanged, drawn, and quartered. According to custom, their heads were placed on spikes atop London Bridge. The Duke of Norfolk's son, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a poet, remained a favorite of the king. The Duke, knowing his family had fallen from grace, wrote an apology on December the 14th to the king, excusing himself and laying all the blame on his niece and stepmother. All of the Howard prisoners were tried, found guilty of concealing treason, and sentenced to life imprisonment and forfeiture of goods. In time, they were released with their goods restored. The king, who by now had what you might call washed his hands of the whole affair, sank further into morbidity, and indulged his appetite for more food and women. These punishing measures against Culpeper and Derham underscore the severity of Henry's stance on betrayal. The charge of high treason extended to any who dared compromise the sanctity of the royal marriage, and in the Tudor worldview, a queen's adultery was seen as an act of treason against the king. Culpeper was granted the merciful death of beheading, likely due to his higher status or Henry's lingering fondness for him, while Derham faced the full horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a fate designed to publicly humiliate and terrorize. For the Howard family, the ramifications were equally grim. The Duke of Norfolk quickly distanced himself from Catherine, effectively washing his hands of her to protect himself and his heir. This was not a family united in adversity, but one that scrambled for survival, showcasing the ruthless self-preservation typical of Tudor nobility. Although they were later released, the damage to their reputation was profound. As for Henry, the emotional toll of yet another marital collapse, combined with his physical maladies, drove him into deeper gloom and indulgence. The entire saga left him more isolated, convinced of his wife's betrayals, and less willing to trust those around him. Catherine's shining moment at court was fully extinguished, replaced by a bleak reality in which she languished in confinement, while her alleged lovers paid with their lives. Catherine herself remained in limbo until Parliament introduced, on January 29, 1542, a bill of attainder which was passed on February 7th. The royal assent by Commission Act of 1541 made it treason, punishable by death, for the queen consort to fail to disclose a sexual history to the king within 20 days of their marriage, or to incite someone to commit adultery with her. This measure solved the matter of Catherine's supposed pre-contract and made her unequivocally guilty. When the lords of the council came for her, she allegedly panicked and screamed as they manhandled her into the barge that would escort her to the Tower on Friday, February 10, 1542. Her flotilla passed under London Bridge, where the heads of Culpeper and Derham were impaled, and remained there until 1546. She passed through Traitor's Gate and then was led to her prison cell. The bill of attainder targeting Catherine Howard stands out as a chilling example of retroactive legislation wielded for a monarch's personal ends. By declaring it treason if a queen failed to disclose her sexual past, Parliament effectively sealed Catherine's doom without the necessity of a formal trial. Tudor law, already heavily skewed toward royal prerogative, found new extremes in Henry's quest to validate his personal sense of betrayal. For Catherine, the moment of arrest was psychologically devastating. She reportedly tried to flee down the corridor, screaming in terror. The imagery of her forced onto a barge, gliding under the rotting heads of Culpeper and Derham, evokes an almost theatrical horror. Passing through Traitor's Gate at the Tower of London, she would have known that few emerged from such an entrance unscathed. The brevity of her queenship and her life was about to be laid bare. It is important to note that while many in Henry's court might have pitied Catherine, they also recognized the king's wrath. Few dared stand in the way of a parliamentary act that codified the king's personal vendetta into law. Catherine's isolation was total, her prospects non-existent. The same parliamentarians who once accepted her as queen now deemed her a traitor. The next day, the Bill of Attainder received royal assent, and Catherine's execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday, February 13, 1542. Arrangements for the execution were supervised by Sir John Gage in his role as Constable of the Tower. The night before her execution, Catherine is believed to have spent many hours practicing how to lay her head upon the block, which had been brought to her at her request. She died with relative composure but looked pale and terrified, and required assistance to climb the scaffold. It was now she would say her final words and describe her punishment. "I ask for forgiveness for my sins, and I know I deserve to die 1,000 deaths for betraying the king who had always treated me so graciously." Catherine was beheaded with a single stroke of the executioner's axe. Lady Rochford was executed immediately afterwards on Tower Green. Both bodies were buried in an unmarked grave in the nearby chapel of St. Peter. King Henry did not attend. Upon hearing news of Catherine's execution, Francis I of France wrote a letter to Henry, regretting the lewd and naughty behavior of the Queen, and advising him that the likeness of women cannot bend the honor of men. This is a truly sad ending. Catherine had little to no impact on the history of England. Her parents gave her to another home, and again there was little in the way of education, and helping these youngsters attain any sort of manners or common decency, or even how to live a respectable lifestyle. It would all add up to be her eventual downfall. She was a joyous and happy lady for much of her young years, and it's also acceptable to believe that she was abused in some ways, tortured just to make some of her acquaintances feel justified in their actions. But at what cost? She left the kingdom of Henry after only 18 short months and had no children in her time. The cruelty of Henry and his self-preservation leaves a sour taste in the mouth. He was simply a control freak who only had time for the person who succumbed completely to his mindset. A 30-year age gap and no true love or emotion left her completely stranded in a vicious world of lies and deceit and ultimately death. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. For more amazing stories, join me today and benefit by subscribing, and check out both of the videos coming up on the screen now. And I'll see you next time here on the History Roadshow. In this final moment of Catherine's life, the stark reality emerges of a teenage queen practicing her execution posture, striving to maintain dignity in a situation that defies comprehension. Many accounts stress how scared she appeared, yet she followed the Tudor custom of uttering a last speech that accepted blame and asked forgiveness. Whether those words reflected genuine repentance or were a forced performance for the sake of a merciful death, they resonate with the era's emphasis on public contrition. Lady Rochford's execution immediately thereafter provided a macabre epilogue. She, too, was found complicit in facilitating Catherine's alleged wrongdoing. Both women were quickly buried in unmarked graves at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the same resting place as Anne Boleyn. For Henry, this ended another failed marriage. He did not attend, distancing himself from the bloodshed he had authorized, while European monarchs like Francis I offered a mixture of reproach and moralizing commentary. The assessment that Catherine had little to no impact on the history of England is widely echoed by historians. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon, she did not set religious or political precedents. Her short queenship was overshadowed by scandal, culminating in a teenage girl's public downfall. Still, her story remains a stark lesson in the lethal interplay of innocence, gossip, and absolute power. She stands as a symbol of how quickly fortune could turn in the Tudor court, especially for those who lacked the resources or counsel to defend themselves. Yet perhaps her life also prompts empathy. Catherine's background, with minimal discipline and guidance, set her on a perilous road. Surrounded by individuals who exploited or neglected her, she struggled to grasp the moral and political scrutiny that came with Henry's ring. Ultimately, she paid the highest price for a combination of earlier traumas, naive decisions, and the king's unyielding sense of betrayal. That's the content of today's video. If you enjoy the video, give us a like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more of our new videos. Thanks for watching.